It's August 29th, 2024. This is Rook. Well, hi there. Welcome to episode 337 of Rook. I'm Jian Gomeshi. Hello to you from Toronto. Salam Dostan Aziz. Durud Bashama. Hope you are doing well wherever you are tuning in from around the world. An episode today, on, we talk a lot about the future of Iran.
Yes.
People talk about the future of Iran. They talk about, is it possible for there to be a democracy in Iran? How would a parliamentary democracy, for example, work in Iran?
Right.
Well, almost 120 years ago, did you know, I think you did know because you're a student of these things, there was the creation of something of a parliamentary democracy in Iran, or an attempt at it. It got a little confused after a while, but something called the Constitutional Revolution, which was ultimately the foundation of a modern Iran, which was then really rolled back by the 1979 Islamic Revolution, etc. But an important moment in history of the Middle East, of Iran, and really globally, kind of an important movement that happened in the early 20th century in Iran. Today, an episode about that.
Yes, can't wait.
More interesting than it sounds.
Much more interesting than it sounds.
I hope it's more interesting than the way I just explained it, but it is. Now, I should explain a few things. First of all, this is not the new season of Rook.
It is not.
It's not September yet.
Nope.
The new season of Rook is coming in the next... First of all, hello, Smart Pegah.
Hello, I was waiting for that.
Sorry.
Hi, Jian.
SPG, Smart Pegah Ganji.
Back in the studio.
Back in the saddle, a new saddle.
Oh my God, I was waiting for you to get to that because I can't even begin to say how incredible this new space is. And I know we're not showing anyone just yet, and we haven't started the new season, but I will give you a preview that my jaw was on the floor when
You
I
have
walked
to
in.
manage expectations now.
No, it's
now
amazing.
You got people. Well, don't say that.
Okay, fine.
First of all, Chesham Nazan. Yeah. First of all, we don't know. I mean, we don't know what people will think. We are going to be all on video starting in a couple of weeks when we launch the new season, which could launch next week or in a couple of weeks. We're so organized that we don't know. The new studio means that Super P is in a whole other room, but still connected to us. Hello, Super P.
Hello.
Thank you for your contribution. And yes, we are in the new studio. It's still somewhat under construction, but almost there.
Yes.
And very exciting. So until the new season of Rook launches, which is imminent, it is still August. It's still summer outside, and we are reviewing some items, some topics that we thought would be really good.
Yes.
And in the last few weeks, we've been going through them. Before we get to this episode on the 1906 Constitutional Revolution in Iran, we should say we have a couple of announcements. First of all, Rook Live 3.
Yeah.
Can we talk about this?
Absolutely.
We've made the announcement that Rook Live 3, which is happening in the Greater Toronto area, just north of Toronto. Sorry for those of you who listen to us in different parts of the world. This is a bit of a Toronto thing, but we do the show live in front of an audience this time where?
At the theater... At City Playhouse Theater. There we go.
Stay with us, Pegah.
City Playhouse Theater.
City Playhouse Theater.
That's
a beautiful new theater.
Stunning
A much bigger theater than we did Rook Live 1 and 2. We do the show in front of an audience and with quite a lineup this time for interviews and performances, including Nusha Farine, Anusha, Solmaz Bargir, Sarah and Ariane, and the Icon Award winner that we're going to give at this event, Shahbal, the great Shahbal Shahbadeh. All part of this show. You'll be there. I'll be there. We'll be doing the show in front of an audience. We invite people to come. Tickets are available now at Eventbrite. This is Friday, September 27th. So just shy of a month away.
That's right.
Friday, September 27th. Do not miss Rook Live 3. The good seats are going. So this time... The seats are numbered.
Yes, they are. That's what I was going to say, actually. It sounds like, it's in September, we've got some time. But really, the good seats are already being grabbed, and because they are numbered seats, you have to ensure that you get the seats you want quicker.
Last time we just sold tickets.
Yes.
And people it was chaos. People just like ran to get their own seats.
To be fair, it was a smaller theater, so,
Yeah.
it was general admission. Everyone could sit kind of where they wanted.
Yeah.
But at this theater, because of the size, because of the way this theater is set up, seats are numbered, and the good seats are going fast.
Get your tickets. You can go to our Instagram, and in the bio, click to where you can get tickets.
That's right.
Or our website, but also at Eventbrite.
At Eventbrite, you can just search for Rook Media, and it'll be the first event that pops up.
ROQE.
Yes.
In case you don't know how to spell the name of the podcast you're listening to. So, Rook Live 3, September 27th. So excited about it. We hope you get tickets. Do come. My voice is a little off because this is the weird thing. I've been under the weather for the first time in months.
And it's not my fault.
And I can't figure out how I got sick because I haven't seen you.
Exactly. So you can't blame it on me this time.
I think it reaches back to the last time I saw you.
Oh, here we go
and
again.
The infection happened. So in between the last time I saw you,
yes,
like a couple of weeks ago, I was in England for a week.
That's right.
And I love going back to England. Now, I think some of my exhaustion and some of my sickness,
right,
whatever it is, because I lost my voice for a few days.
I was going to say,
I was worried about that. I do sound better now, but it may have to do with the situation in England that I was dealing with.
What was the situation?
Now, let me first say, there's a guy named Kambiz Hosseini.
Oh, sure. Right?
We love Kambiz.
Yes,
I love Kambiz Hosseini.
Yeah.
Sometimes he says controversial things. I love the guy. Kambiz Hosseini, which has been he's a long-time satirist or writer. He was involved in theater. Brilliant guy. Also a great broadcaster who has had a very popular podcast for many years. He was also had a show called Politique and then Parasite. So Kambiz Hosseini has moved to Iran International, the network, the Iranian network.
Right.
And he's got a new primetime show that's going to be launching, I think, 9 p.m. every night, Iran time, I think, on Iran International. And he's doing it from London, England. Okay. So Kambiz, who was a mainstay of New York and then lived in LA for a bit, etc., has moved to London.
Everyone's going to London. Okay.
London's, come on, London's the best.
All
so
right.
I mean, Toronto's the best, but London's the best. So
Ottawa's the best.
Toronto is not the best. I'm sorry.
Okay, so slow down, Super B. There's a lot of Toronto listeners of this podcast.
Toronto is the best.
So I mentioned to a few friends that I'm coming to England, and Kambiz, God love him, beautiful guy, lovely guy, good friend, says you can stay with me.
Nice.
Now, he mentions something like, I don't have a lot of room, but you're welcome to stay with me. And he says, actually, you're going to have to sleep on a couch.
Okay.
Right? So I'm like,
a pull-out couch?
Yeah. I'm like, well, that's probably not, Kambiz he's a decadent guy. He's a, fancy guy, sort of. How bad can this couch be? So he sends me a picture of the couch. You know those mirrors that you have on the side of the car that says objects may appear larger than they really are or whatever?
Right.
So I look at the couch picture and I'm like, oh, it's fine. It's a couch,
It's a couch. Okay.
I'll put a blanket on it and, I get to this Kambiz's apartment, in London. And first of all, he's busy. He doesn't even, he leaves me a key. And, first of all, I go into the apartment. He's just moved to London. There's not a lot there. I go into the bathroom. There's a fucking giant Chelsea flag.
Okay.
The football team, Chelsea.
Oh my God.
Right? I'm Arsenal through and through. In my blood, Arsenal.
Yes, I do.
So that seems antagonistic.
Okay.
I mean, even if he's a Chelsea fan, which apparently now he is. I'm like, why would you put this in the bathroom on the first day that I come to your... But second of all, this couch... I mean,
was there a Chelsea flag on the couch too?
No, the couch. Calling it a couch or a sofa is a little generous.
Okay,
it's basically like a love seat. It's basically.
How different was this photo from what you saw?
It basically can almost fit two people sitting very closely to each other.
Okay.
In other words, half of my torso. I'm not a short person,
Right.
I couldn't sleep on this thing without half of my body dangling over the side of it.
Wow.
I didn't sleep at all.
How long were you there for?
And I felt bad saying anything to him. Like after the first day, I think he came out and he's got this lovely dog, Niku. He saw me in the living room and he saw that my body doesn't fit on this couch. And he was like, you can sleep in my bed, ta det för mig, And I was like, no, I'm fine. Oh my God. And then he's smoking all the time, and there's the whole thing.
And there's a Chelsea flag.
There's a Chelsea flag. He didn't have a kettle, and then the Tarof, like I went to buy him a kettle, and I said, well, I called him from the place, what color do you want? And then he said, no, and he went and bought one, like, it was like irony kind of stuff. I love him, but the couch was...
It's like no matter what we do, the Tarof conversation comes up again.
And then I felt bad, like... Then what do? I'm there for like 8 or 9 days.
That's what I was going to say.
Do I move to a hotel?
Oh.
Like that seems kind of insulting.
Right.
But then I also thought maybe he wants me to move. Maybe that's why he gave me the shitty couch. This guy.
So did you end up going to a hotel or you stayed the whole time?
No, I stayed the whole time. I'm sick. I mean, I didn't sleep for a week.
You didn't sleep for a week.
It was, and then his air conditioning wasn't working, and which he was fine with. But he was like, "Oh, you Canadians, you come here, you want air conditioning." And I'm like, I'm an asthmatic, and he's smoking, and the whole thing was...
Oh, wow. So how was your London trip overall?
I know, it was great. I saw lots of friends.
Your photos looked great. They looked like you were having a great time.
Yeah,
the
all
photos.
of our friends over there, and I kid. I mean, what a lovely guy. Come, I've just moved to London. Come stay with me. It was, it's really beautiful.
Objects may appear smaller.
Objects may appear larger. Do not trust somebody's photo of their couch. And
well, honestly,
Chelsea flag and
the photo thing that you're talking about, I've been dealing with that.
Now you, on the other hand, despite the fact that you will be here for our new season of Rook,
yes, I will.
but you'll be traveling back and forth between Toronto and the capital of Canada, Ottawa.
That's right.
A very nice, quiet...
Oh, God. Let me tell you.
City.
So 2 things I've learned about Ottawa recently. First of all, this photo thing, I think it's something new because people are using some sort of camera that does not reflect what you see in reality. So I'm obviously apartment hunting and things like that because I need a place in Ottawa. And all of these photos, they make these units look like these grand, beautiful...
when you want to go rent a place.
Yeah, when I want to go rent a place. And then it's like you walk in and it's nothing.
Everything
like
can look good on an iPhone now.
Yeah, seriously. So that's the first thing. The second thing, you would think I'm going to the capital. It's a nice, clean, family-friendly environment. Downtown Ottawa? Oh, it is like there's
not a lot happening.
Nah, there's not a lot happening. And then once it's like from
you have to
7
find
PM,
your scene.
From 7 p.m. onwards, then it's like I'm kind of being careful about where I go. And
that
sort of thing.
This was you wanted this.
This is an opportunity thing,
All right.
But it's been interesting.
Well, it's good to have you here.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I'm looking forward to this new season of Rook. I'm looking forward to Rook Live 3.
Yes.
I'm looking forward to curing myself of...
and getting some decent sleep.
Whatever this... this Combies, he was fine, too. I mean, I was deteriorating each day.
Right.
No, his bed was massive.
Well,
the guy has a giant, bed. It was me and the dog on the couch. It was a...
you and Niku.
Little Niku. Oh, Niku's wonderful.
I've seen a photo of
I think
Niku.
you can tell a person from, I say this knowing that I have a well-trained, wonderful dog, but I think you can tell what a person is like from how their dog acts.
Mm-hmm.
Like Niku is just wonderful. Beautiful, loving, really, doesn't cause a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
A lot quieter than Combies, actually. If there's one, if between the two of them, the one that barks is Combies. I think more than...
Too funny.
All right. We'll do the episode.
Yes.
It's exciting to be in the new studio of Rook.
Very.
Can't wait for people to see it.
I know.
Let's get to this episode, and then let's reconvene for the new season of Rook.
That's right.
In the coming week or two.
Yes. Soon. We'll leave it at that.
It is impossible, Pegah, to look at the contemporary history of Iran without placing focus on an event that is generally considered kind of a pivotal turning point and foundation of modern Iran. That's the constitutional revolution of 1906. So in the early 20th century, in the midst of widespread discontent with the corruption and inefficacy of the Qajar Dynasty and its new leader, Muzaffar-ud-Din Shah, a powerful movement formed and mobilized aimed at changing the structure of the monarchy from despotic to constitutional and to adopt representative governance by introducing the country to a parliamentary system. It further resulted in a written constitution in which a separation between different branches of government was recognized. So here's this Iran that people think of this as this, Islamic theocracy, which it is, and backwards in some ways in terms of being anti-democratic and stuff. And here's this movement and this event that happens, like I say, almost 120 years ago, that is about democracy. Like much of Iranian history, it was not as simple as all that. That same landmark constitution was abolished only a year later. A coup and civil war ensued. And before it was reestablished in 1909, with Iran subsequently finding a new 11-year-old Shah at the helm. This is Ahmad Shah, right?
Right.
So the question on today's episode, how important was the period of the constitutional revolution in the formation of modern Iran? Mm-hmm. What gave rise to it, and what is its legacy? And how do we assess the goals of a pursuit of liberal secularism or parliamentary democracy, the containment of clerical dominance, and the limiting of power of the monarchy in the aftermath and the century that followed? So, our guest today is an Iranian-British historian, author, and scholar who has quite literally published a book on this subject. Dr. Ali Massoud Ansari is an expert in modern history with a focus on the Middle East. Dr. Ansari is a professor of Iranian history and founding director of the Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of St. Andrews, a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, an associate fellow at Chatham House, and the president of the British Institute for Persian Studies. Dr. Ansari was born in Rome, Italy, obtained his master's degree from King's College in London and his doctorate from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Dr. Ansari has published articles in prestigious journals and newspapers such as The Guardian, The Independent, and The New Statesman, and has been a regular presence at events and conferences about Iran. He is the author of several books, including The Politics of Nationalism in Modern Iran, Iran, A Very Short Introduction, Iran, Islam and Democracy, The Politics of Managing Change, and germane to today's episode, his book of 2016, Iran's Constitutional Revolution of 1906 and Narratives of the Enlightenment. Dr. Ali Ansari joined me from Fife, Scotland. Here's our conversation. Hello, sir.
Hello, and thank you for that introduction. I should just perhaps give you a slight correction on the wonderful list of titles you gave me, because I'm no longer at Chatham House and I'm no longer president of the British Institute of Persian Studies. So I used to be, so that can go in the past, but maybe that can be basically removed.
If you're no longer the president, I'm not sure we can continue with this interview.
I know,
but
I thought, maybe be led on a false pretense.
Your titles rise and fall like the Shahs of the early 20th century.
Well, we like the academics, they like to accumulate titles, that's the thing, yeah.
It is a great pleasure to talk to you and to have read your book. Thank you for doing this.
Very pleased to be here.
Let me start with this. I mean, if you'll forgive the simple nature of the question, it seems like an accepted orthodoxy that the constitutional revolution of the early 20th century in Iran marks the beginning of modern Iran. Do you agree?
In a broad sense, yes. I mean, I think for me, as your excellent introduction actually sort of outlined, for me, this is the pivotal moment. This is the moment where Iran effectively enters the modern age with a constitutional system, ostensibly a legal system. And of course, for me and for others who study this, the constitutional revolution basically sets the political template for the country for the next century and beyond. And we still talk about it. It's an extraordinary event in sort of completely changing the nature of the political organization of the country. And for instance, even after the Islamic Revolution in 1979, those basic elements of a sort of at least in theory, a constitutional system of having a parliament and so on and so forth, nobody's ever done without it. They probably systematically ignored parliaments and ignored things, but nobody's had the sort of the courage to get rid of it. So in a sense, it's become something that's quite fixed in the political landscape of Iran.
All right. Well, I want to get to all of that. Let me ask you about terminology to begin with.
Sure.
I have found it confusing. That, in fact, I'm grateful that I've had the opportunity to read your book and learn more about the Constitutional Revolution, because it's always been confusing to me that the term Constitutional Revolution is associated with a period of 5 years or so. You mean establishing a constitution usually has a year associated, like the 1776 in America or the Constitution Act of 1867 in Canada. But I understand the terminology we use for Iran is to refer to the establishment of the constitution, but also to the entire movement of the period, correct?
Well, I mean, basically, when you look at it depends how, historians love to sort of categorize time periods and eras, and they tend to sort of look at, the period from, the end of 1905, 1906 onwards to, some people say up to 1921 really is the constitutional period. I mean, other people will shorten it. And it's really this era when the constitution was being established, debated, contested, so on and so forth. I mean, I would argue, and I have argued in other places, that basically it lays the template which extends much further, and that henceforth, again, whether people ignore the constitution or otherwise in practice, they can't ignore it in theory. So it's something that shapes the way in which Iranians henceforth think about their politics. But yes, I mean, it's seen in sort of most standard histories as a specific period in Iran's modern history.
Take us back, Dr. Ansari, to the 19th century. I mean, before we get to the specifics of what precipitated the constitutional revolution, give us a sense of life in the second half of the 19th century, rather, under Nasser al-Din Shah. In what ways was the structure of monarchy and perhaps despotism of the Qajar era eroding to the point where, going into the 20th century, a collective will would come about to bring structural change on a constitutional order?
Well, the sort of the decline of the Iranian state, the decline of the Qajar state, had been really taking place since the early 19th century. But it was only, as you say, in a sense, in the second half of the 19th century that people began to sort of address these issues much more earnestly. And I think there was some early hope under Nasser al-Din Shah's reign, when he had the very active and energetic and reforming prime minister that we know, known to posterity as Amir Kabir, who basically tried to reimagine, the Iranian state, to bring it into some sort of sense of, efficiency and ability to deal with what they perceived to be the challenge, really, of European powers and European imperialism, particularly what was going on in the north, the Russians, but of course the British, who were establishing themselves in India. So Amir Kabir's death, basically his execution, by Nasser al-Din Shah, basically terminates that early promise of the hope of change. And really what you see for the rest of the 19th century is this sort of gradual sort of decline in inactivity, with a lot of agitation from intellectuals, some who come from sort of what we might term the clerical classes, but also from the landowning classes and others, who are trying to agitate for greater and greater reform, but finding themselves also caught between the sort of rival imperial powers of Britain and Russia, that often curtails the possibility of doing anything, certainly from the Russian side.
Right.
But also, what it means is that, nothing happens. We get into this sort of, a stagnation, really.
The death of Nasser al-Din Shah seems pivotal here. I mean, he's assassinated after 50 years on the throne, mind you, in 1896. His son, Mozaffar al-Din Shah, takes over. But he's a very different personality. How would you describe the change?
Well, I mean, really, if strictly speaking, what we should look is a little bit further back, actually, in terms of the tobacco revolt, which was a revolt against an economic concession given to a British entrepreneur, really a bit of a wheeler dealer, and not the best concession ever offered, it has to be said, and one in which Nasser al-Din Shah had offered really to gain a bit of extra money. He was fairly frugal with his own money. He sought to sort of sell off various assets in order to raise money to do the various things he wanted to do, basically travel abroad. And that tobacco revolt is seen by a number of writers, including the British Orientalist Edward Brown, as a pivotal moment. The opposition to that tobacco concession, the fact that opposition mobilized to basically force the Shah's hand to remove the concession. Edward Brown and others say this is the beginning of the Persian or the Iranian awakening. This is the time when basically a sort of a political awakening happens. But it's a modest thing. I mean, the thing is that in the history of the sort of political awakening and sort of liberal movements in that sense, there is a sense that something can be done. We can resist the monarch, we can force his hand, we can get him to change very unpopular policies.
A crack in the armor, right?
Yeah, that's what it is. I mean, I think some people exaggerate its consequences, but nonetheless, it's a significant moment. But you're quite right. The Shah is then assassinated in 1896. We still sort of settle back into a sort of element of stagnation. His son comes in, and with great sort of tragic irony in some ways, his son is even more inept and even more inactive than the father. So, this sort of notion that, we have a new king on the throne, he might have a bit more energy, he might be able to want to do things. Actually, he doesn't. Mozaffar ad-Din Shah is actually, more anxious to acquire title and honors and prestige than his father, but probably, does even less. So the malaise is really settling in.
So how does Mozaffar ad-Din Shah, Qajar's weakness, that ineptitude you've just spoke about, not to mention, from what I understand, he's not as much of a strong man, he has more liberal tendencies. How does that, at the turn of the century, translate into the conditions where Iranian educated elites and even religious authorities are interested in a curb on royal authority and the establishment of some kind of rule of law?
Well, what's interesting about it, I mean, I wouldn't call Mozaffar ad-Din Shah liberal, by the way. I mean, I don't think he had a particularly a liberal bone in his body, actually. I mean, he's basically, his hand is forced in 1906 to make concessions, and he's also very ill. But there are issues building up really at the end of the 19th century, a lot of pressures building up, particularly from intellectuals. There are very prominent religious intellectuals as well, such as Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, who basically agitate for reform, who demand a constitution, the rule of law. There's the Armenian-Iranian Malkam Khan, who's sitting in London, produces a newspaper called Qanun, which he sort of harangues the Qajar government and says, in order to move anywhere, we need the rule of law. I mean, basically, they promote these liberal ideas that they get really from France and Britain. And in 1899, for instance, there's a school of political science and law is established in Tehran by Furughi, I think his father, and also the prominent intellectual of the constitution afterwards. And these all start to feed in and seed ideas. But what's fascinating about the revolution itself is that what sparks it is something quite small, and it as with all with these things, it's quite trivial and not really foreseen. It's normally to do, as in this case, with a sort of like a tax revolt. There's a very, very avaricious Belgian customs official by the name of Monsieur Naus, who basically goes around trying to collect customs revenues. He's seen as corrupt. He's seen as oppressive. And basically, it's his, oppressive tendencies that tends to sparks off a certain protest. But the most interesting thing is that the last sort of British sort of report at the end of 1905, dispatched to London at the beginning of 1906, makes no indication, sort of basically says that nothing is happening in this country. The country is just stagnating. And, yes, there's been some protests in certain areas, but we can't see anything happening. And it's a salutary lesson, actually, that, even with widespread sort of diplomats, intelligence on the ground, whatever, sometimes you just don't see things coming until they hit you in the face. Right. And literally, it's a few weeks later that the whole process of the protests emerging starts to galvanize, and what we now know is the constitutional revolution basically starts to unfold.
Not the only Iranian revolution of the 20th century. Some people didn't see coming, right?
Exactly. Well, or any movement. I mean, I often say to students as well, if you look at the Arab Spring or you look at other things, these things are often triggered by seemingly quite trivial incidents.
Well, you talked about the British and the Russians. I mean, there's also and I'm glad that you were giving a specific example to illustrate this. I was thinking of one where there's an imposition of tariffs to repay a Russian loan for Mozaffar ad-Din's royal tour. I mean, it's such a cheap kind of event, and yet you can see even in the contemporary context how that would draw the ire of the citizens, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, we also have to understand that the politically active segment of the population at this stage in Iran is very small, but it's quite active. I mean, this is the difference. I mean, I think some foreign observers look at it and they say, well, nothing is really happening. But the fact is, we have a population in Iran of perhaps, say, about, I mean, we don't know for sure, but say around 10 million. The population of Tehran itself is perhaps, we can estimate, around 250,000. These are fairly small, but then that also means that the politically active population is likewise small, but it's quite influential. And, a lot of them are agitating for changes. And in some cases, the British, at the end of the 19th century, or, certainly the second half of the 19th century, were actively engaged in sort of trying to satisfy some of these reformist yearnings by supporting ideas for political change. But a lot of that was resisted by the court, be it Nasruddin Shah or Muzaffar ad-Din Shah, because also that's where the Russians were most powerful. The Russians had a much firmer grip on the court, and they weren't interested in any idea of liberal sort of constitutionalism. The Tsar was an autocrat, and what he wanted to see in Iran was similar autocracy. And of course, that's where, what happens in 1906 is actually a very, very strange coincidence of events, a coincidence of events, conjunction of events, if you will, that allow the constitutional revolution actually to unfold. And one of the important things is that Russia is temporarily taken off the scene.
Right.
I mean,
right.
That's something that's quite important.
Since you're mentioning the political class and ideas, and your book that you've edited deals with the ideas of the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Let me ask you just briefly about that as sort of a sidebar, and if you can do this simply, how did Iran's constitutional movement draw on a diverse range of ideas and orientations that in good measure were associated with the Enlightenment?
Well, a number of Iranians had been going to the West really since 1815, actually. I mean, a steady trickle had been going to the West. They went to France. They went to Britain in particular. They wrote some very interesting travelogues and accounts of their experiences there. And they were really taken by the political system, particularly in Britain, actually, is what impressed them. And they compared it and contrasted it with what they found at home, and realized in some ways that, what Britain had in some ways was they'd applied certain lessons of what we would now term the Enlightenment. So basically things about the rule of law, a sense of discipline and order, good governance, education and other things. And of course the British in their early days certainly argued with the Iranians, who they were trying to basically cultivate. I mean, they sought to cultivate them against their Russian opponents in that sense, was to say, look, these are ideas that you can absorb, you can turn to good effect and apply in your own country. They never said, for instance, that the Iranians or anyone else was actually incapable of doing these things. They would actually, if you look at early accounts, the British would say, look, 200 years ago, we were nothing. But, we've applied ourselves and look what we've become. If you do it, you can do this too. And of course, that's a very attractive, argument to many reformers who thought, well, this is a way to deal with it. They just suffered defeats at the hands of the Russians. They wanted to find ways to deal with that. And what these thinkers were saying was it's not simply a case of building a better army. A lot of people would say, well, what you need to do is you need to strengthen your armed forces. What the British were actually saying to them was that you cannot build better armed forces if you don't change the political system you have in order to sustain that. And these are the ideas that were coming through. And by the end of the 19th century, it's quite powerfully expressed by a number of thinkers. I've already mentioned two, like Afghani and Malcolm Khan. Right. But then you see others. And one of the things which I've talked about, and it's also, I think, in that book, it's very striking the number of Iranian intellectuals throughout the 19th century that become members of Masonic lodges. They all become Freemasons. And the reason they become Freemasons is because it allows them a sort of an entry into this sort of international intellectual brotherhood. And this is the way they absorb these ideas. Basically, to become a Freemason, you just have to believe in God. That's absolutely fine. You're a Muslim. You can do that. You don't have to believe in anything else. But it brings you in. You're no longer an outsider. You're part of that sort of movement. And of course, Freemasonry in those days had quite a different sort of agenda. It was very iconoclastic. It was very anti-organized religion. It in many ways, very progressive. I mean, it promoted progressive ideas. So these were things. So if you look at the constitutional revolution itself, for instance, almost every constitutional leader of note came from a single lodge in Tehran. They all were members of a single lodge. And these were means by which these ideas, in my view,
okay, hang on a second. Just with respect to the Enlightenment, and forgive the naivete of this question.
Sure.
As a kid of the late 20th century, early 21st century, I don't, and who grew up in the West, by the way, like you. I mean, I don't totally understand. You write at one point in the introduction essay to that book, you say Iran's written constitution introduced modern concepts of citizenship and political rights to Iranian politics. Okay.
Yeah.
So I look at that and go, wait, what was the thinking around citizenship and rights before this? I mean, what if this was being introduced, what was citizenship before it was introduced?
Well, basically, prior to that, you see the ideas, and there are a number of interesting discussions between, as far where my work lies, really between British and Iranian officials in the early 19th century and others, and they talk about that. They talk about the different nature of their political systems, and the Iranian political system is basically an authoritarian system based around the monarch, and the monarch has his subjects. I mean, you have to look at it in terms of the monarch and his subjects, and the monarch has, theoretically at least, absolute control. Okay, an absolute authority. Now, these are obviously delimited in some ways, either by religion and also the ability to do things. But there's no sort of constitutional, legal, or other sort of control on the monarch's power. And there's a very famous scene recounted by a British official. This is, in the early 19th century, when he talks to Fath Ali Shah, who's the second Qajar monarch, and they contrast the different systems. And Fath Ali Shah says to this official, Sir John Malcolm, he says, "It sounds to me as if your monarch is simply the first magistrate. He doesn't really have much power. He can't really do much. He's subject to the law."
Hang on a second. Are you saying that the concept of citizenship then, pre-constitution, would be you're not necessarily the citizen of a country, you're the subject of a monarch?
Yes. So basically in the early so if you look if we're discussing here, what are one of the contributions of the ideas of the Enlightenment? And remember that when I was looking at that book, I talk about narratives of the Enlightenment in the plural, because there are obviously different types. And there's the French Enlightenment, there's the British, there are different aspects of it, and it's a very big sort of European movement. And sometimes you can't ascribe, by the way, national characteristics, but it's quite interesting to see how different strands develop in different areas. And of course, the difference is really that concepts of rights, I mean, the idea that a citizen, you have a right, is a very, very 18th century Enlightenment idea. I mean, prior to that, you don't have the concept of rights. So it's not something that is as established as you get then. Yes, there are sort of monarchs in the past who talk about almost like a sort of a social contract of sorts. I will do this, you will do that, so on and so forth. We exchange it. But the notion that as you get, I think expressed most obviously in the American Declaration of Independence, that we are endowed with inalienable rights. This is something that's really a product of 18th century political thought.
See, when the actual 1906 Constitution gets created, why was it not an option? I mean, given the dissatisfaction, given the will to change things, and again, maybe this is a naive question, but why was it not an option just to get rid of the monarchy altogether and establish a parliamentary system only, vis-a-vis like America?
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, it's a fascinating question, because basically the three options ahead of them are the British system, the French system, and the American system. The way they look at it is they see the British system as most suitable to what they want to do, and partly it's also to do with the fact that by overthrowing the monarch would be, in a sense, seen as a step too far, right? I mean, for them, they want to get something done. So they find, in a sense, a medium line to it. So they don't want to get rid of the monarch. And the revolutionaries say this. They say there are people who argue that, particularly the Russians would say, when they were trying to rubbish the constitutional movement, that your role, you're anarchists, you're basically the equivalent today of terrorists or something, and you want to overthrow the entire system. Now, there were many clerics who supported, obviously, the constitutional revolution, and they would not have supported the constitutional revolution, I think, at the time, if you were getting rid of the monarch altogether. I mean, this is not 1979.
The clerics liked the monarch. They liked having a monarchy.
Because the monarch is basically also a concept that sits quite well within their Islamic worldview. Okay, as long as he's a Muslim monarch, of course. I mean, this is what we're talking about. So it's not something that you see in 1979. This is quite different. I mean, 1979 has different antecedents, of course, different influences. The influence, to my mind, of the Constitutional Revolution that is the most profound is the British model. I mean, that's what they want to follow, and they're most impressed by that. They have some ideas of the American system, but they're not as familiar with it. And the French system is too far for them. The idea in the French system that you execute your monarch and so on and so forth is not something they want to. This would be too disruptive. The order would be too disruptive. Of course, the British had executed their monarch, back in the 17th century, but it's not something that has any proximity. And for them, the British model of parliamentary, in a sense, democracy with a limited franchise, by the way. I mean, it's not I hesitate to use the word democracy because these are not terms they would have necessarily used themselves. I mean, what they talk about a lot is the republic. And when they use the term republic, of course, in the 19th century, what they're meaning is a system of the rule of law. So the British system and the French system are both republics in that sense. One has a monarch, one doesn't. But the fact is that's the way they look at it. These distinctions that we are familiar with come later.
Beyond the establishment of institutional laws, how did the Constitution and the Constitutional Revolution enshrine and embolden Iranian nationalism? In a previous episode in this series, we talked about this period being the start of the Persianization of the country. In fact, we were speaking to somebody, a professor who's a Kurdish expert, talking about how this was the beginning of dissatisfaction amongst the Kurds because they suddenly say we're being left out because we're seeing Persianization. How does Iranian nationalism play into the Constitutional Revolution?
Well, certainly it feeds into it. It certainly feeds into it and it comes out of it too. And one of the reasons is, I mean, these are some of the consequences of the vision that they have that, of course, does tend to erase differences. So you've got to understand that Iran, at the end of I always describe Iran in some senses as an imperial kingdom. It's basically made of a multitude of different peoples. The term Iran itself is, yes, it's a territory, it's a political territory, but it's also a geographic term. So it's the guarded domains of Iran is the official title in a sense. But coming out of the Constitutional Revolution, it's quite true, is that Iran then becomes a sort of a national identity in a much, much more evocative way. And Iran and its intellectuals are much more successful of basically transforming this imperial state of the 19th century, if you can use that term, into a national state in the 20th century without significant loss of territory. I mean, the Ottomans weren't successful at this. Other empires were not successful. But the Iranians did it in some ways. But one of the costs of this is exactly what your previous speaker, in a sense, says. So let me give you an example. I always use this example. One of the things that the constitutional revolutionaries wanted to do, they never got round, they never able to. Ultimately, it lies in the time of Reza Shah when this happens. But what they want to do is they want to introduce, they say, we have to educate our public. We have to educate them. The Enlightenment, these ideas in the Enlightenment, what we need to do is we need to educate our public. But when that comes up, people say, well, how do we start this? How do we do this? Well, we have to get a language of instruction. Okay, so how do you do this? Well, we need a standard language of instruction. And then, of course, it gradually resides that when they start mass producing education in a sense, the language that is chosen clearly is Persian. Persian is the language that at least is the first language or at least the second language of the majority of the population, and it's seen as a unifying factor on the Iranian plateau. It's part of Persian culture. So naturally, in a sense, if you're going to pursue sort of policies of mass education, a sort of development of a modern state in a way, what you end up seeing actually is the gradual erasure, in a sense, of the differences and distinctions, because it's just simply not possible to do it otherwise. In the Ottoman Empire, by the way, as an example, when they did that, when they wanted to introduce mass education, what they decided to do then was to opt for the language of the majority of the population at the time. And the language of the majority of the population was Ottoman Turkish or Turkish and Anatolia. But of course, that alienated all the Arab centers of the empire, and that's one of the reasons why the Ottoman Empire could not hold together. But Persian was seen as a language that could keep, most of the peoples of the Iranian state together.
Okay, so by 1906, We have a constitution, and then the next few years play out like an episode of Game of Thrones. I mean, it does. It's this messed up roller coaster. So Muzaffar al-Din, who presides over the constitution, then dies. 40 days later,
very conveniently.
His son Muhammad Ali. No relation. Is then, no relation to Muhammad Ali. Right? It's the son of Muzaffar. He is opposed to the Constitution. By 1907, he's in power, dissolves the National Assembly, abolishes the Constitution. Why?
Well, we have to sort of turn the clock back slightly here, because in 1906, as I was mentioning earlier, is a period when the Russians are off the scene. Okay, so the Russians are off the scene. They suffered a defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, which is absolutely shocking. I mean, most people around the world, they couldn't believe that the Russians had lost a war to the Japanese, an Asian power. Then they have the Russian Revolution of 1905. This is also a disaster. Tsar Nicholas is basically slightly in retreat. He's pulled away. The British are much more, in terms of the power in Iran, are much more freer, have much more freedom of action. And certainly the constitutionalists go to the British. And of course, one of the famous events of 1906 is the sanctuary that Iranian intellectuals, and if you remember, I said earlier that the population of Tehran was probably around 250,000. 14,000 people seek sanctuary in the British Embassy compound in Golhak. And it's from there that basically the details of the constitution are worked out. And they go to the British Chargé d'Affaires. There's only a Chargé d'Affaires at the time. And he is basically entrusted with negotiating the settlement of a constitution. So that's what happens within Iran. Unfortunately for the Iranian constitutionalists, the government in London is not remotely interested in supporting this, because what they're more into, it's a great tragedy, to be honest. And I think a great mistake of British policy at the time. The foreign secretary at the time of a new liberal government, as it happens, basically comes in and he's more interested in securing the security of Britain in Europe. And the security of Britain in Europe means basically containing Germany. Containing Germany means an alliance with the French and by extension the Russians, who are the allies of the French. What this means is that by 1907, the British sign a convention with the Russians to settle their disputes in Asia, so they can look forward to a much more constructive relationship in Europe. This is a disaster, the Anglo-Russian Convention, because basically what the British, for reasons that are known probably only to Edward Grey, they basically agree that the north of Iran, all those populated centers, all those areas of constitutional agitation become part of the Russian sphere of influence. And that Russian sphere of influence, the British will not interfere in. And it's there that, Muhammad Ali, what I was saying earlier, of course, the Russians are much more, in control in the court. They have much more influence. Muhammad Ali is a reactionary with a capital R. And he basically, with Russian encouragement, goes off to suppress the constitutional movement. He's not interested in it. And of course, the British don't do anything. They don't do anything because they say we signed an agreement with the Russians.
But I don't understand why it was so easy to, I get what you're saying about Tabriz and the north and the Russian influence, but why it was so, I was in preparation for this interview rereading Abbas Amonat's book, Modern Iran, and he talks about how the support for the constitutional revolution was pluralistic. There was this diverse social and political groups participating. Why was it so easy? By 1908, there's a coup, there's the destruction of the Majlis, the abandoning of the constitution. I'm not saying it was easy, but why does it get rolled back so dramatically only a year or two later?
Well, there are two things, basically. The first thing is that the Russians bring force. Okay, so the Russians have basically control over the one military force in the country that is worth anything, and that's the Cossack Brigade. And the Cossack Brigade basically is mobilized really in favor of the anti-revolutionaries and in favor of the monarch. They're also not ill-disposed or not shy about sending troops across the border if they need to. That's what they do. So they this is pure, repression. The other side of it, of course, is that the constitutionalists then realize that there is no hope of support from the British. The British seem to be absent from the scene. And there's a very famous appeal to England that one of the prominent revolutionaries, Hassan Taghisade, does when he goes to London in 1908 to plead with the British to come to the assistance of the constitutional revolutionaries. And he makes a very interesting point. He says, we're not asking you to interfere in our politics. We're quite prepared to manage this situation ourselves. But we are asking you to stop the Russians interfering in our politics. It's an interesting nuance, And of course, the British at the time are just, basically absent without leave. I mean, they don't want to do it. And that's why basically there is, certainly in 1907 and, this period, that there is, what they call the minor autocracy or minor dictatorship.
Yeah.
But then finally, the revolutionaries, build up a momentum, a force of their own with certain tribal groups and others, and Sattar Khan in the north, and they basically are able to put Muhammad Ali back in his box. But it's a struggle. I mean, basically, the country descends into a very, very fractious civil war, and it's partly the consequence, I have to say, that also the constitutionalists themselves were extremely idealistic about what they thought they could achieve. And, when the first parliament sat, it sort of suddenly occurred to them that they had none of the means, no means of government. I mean, there was no sort of bureaucracy or anything. I mean, the government of the Qajars.
Right.
So when they sort of sit in parliament, they say things like, we're going to have mass education, we're going to have a railway line, we're going to have conscription.
And there's no infrastructure.
And someone says, well, how are you going to do this? Right. And they said, and this is the interesting thing, they say, well, the king will pay for it. He says, no, I'm not going to pay for it. You have to raise taxes. But then, of course, when you say raise taxes, they say, well, how are we going to raise taxes? I mean, there's nothing. Do you see? I mean, do you see the problem? I mean, the problem is there.
Right. So there's this fractious civil war over the next 2 years. And then in July 1909, as you've intimated, pro-constitution forces marched from the provinces to Tehran, deposed the Shah, Muhammad Ali, reestablished the constitution. And then something funny happens, which is, I mean, again, I understand that I'm doing this through the prism of the 21st century sitting in the West, but the parliament votes to place, so the constitution is reestablished. Majlis is there. Then the parliament votes to place Muhammad Ali's 11-year-old son, Ahmad Shah, on the throne. I mean, if these enlightened constitutionalists were so enlightened, could they not have predicted that this is going to end in disaster over the next decade?
No, not if you sort of believe that. You see what they're arguing. I mean, and this is a very sort of like it's a standard procedure. I mean, what's very interesting about it is that the parliament takes the decision to depose a particular monarch and put another one on the throne, and that's precisely, actually, if you look at it, what the British parliamentary system did in the 17th century. Of course, I mean, they deposed and then they put people that they considered to be more favourable. Of course, Ahmad Shah is very young, but also they try and imbue in this idea that his form of kingship has to be different to his father's. I mean, it's that sort of element. It's not entirely, I have to say, misplaced at all. I mean, these are things that would have been quite common, really. I think to even. You could see in revolutionaries in other countries. Not all revolutions. I mean, I think our problem is that we see all revolutions through the prism of the French, Russian, and Islamic Revolution in 1979, and that slightly colours what we're thinking. I would say, I mean, this is my argument, and I say this to students actually. I say, which was more successful, the American Revolution or the French Revolution? And it's a question that people have to ask. I would argue actually in some ways the American Revolution, which has had much more profound consequences, and it was a much less violent. It wasn't non-violent by any stretch of imagination, but it was a much less violent and much less dramatic, in a sense, revolution than the French Revolution. In that,
But you get what I'm saying. I mean, here we are talking about political rights, the establishment of law, infrastructure, education, and now let's put an 11-year-old on the throne. I mean, it seems at odds. And was the idea that Ahmad Shah would somehow be easier to control?
Well, I mean, the point is, of course, according to the Constitution, the Shah is only meant to reign, not rule. So an 11-year-old's perfect. He just needs to sit there and do the symbolic stuff. The responsibility for government lies to his ministers. That's the change in the system. So the monarchy represents the authority of the state, but he shouldn't be doing day-to-day running a government, and he doesn't have responsibility. So in that way, there's no contradiction there, to be honest.
Dr. Ansari, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
You're quite right to say, by the way, it doesn't work. I mean, ultimately, it doesn't work. But all I'm saying
I'm just saying, couldn't somebody have said, he's 11?
No, because it doesn't work, not for reasons basically of the Shah. It doesn't work because the whole constitutional system becomes ineffectual. I mean, what you're arguing, I don't think it has to do with his age, but what ultimately happens is precisely, you go through the Great War, which is devastating for Iran, the First World War, and then ultimately what they find is that they say that and this is it's not just, let's set conspiracy theories aside for the time being. There's a lot of Iranian intellectuals who say, look, what we really need is, this constitution is all very well and good, but what we need is government. We need forms of government and governance, and so we need something. So, what they end up finding, of course, is a strong man, that comes in the form of Reza Khan.
Shah,
but you have to remember that when Reza Khan / Reza Shah comes in with Tabatabai and others in 1921, again, they're not overthrowing the monarch. They don't overthrow Ahmad Shah. They just simply say, we're getting rid of your government, we're going to give you a decent government, and we're going to start building the state. Ultimately, exactly as you say, obviously Reza Khan has ambitions that are, in another direction. There are many of his supporters who say, actually, let's get rid of these Rajahs because, frankly, they've been useless. And let's bring in a new dynamic national monarchy, which is how they identify the
Before we get to Reza Shah, though, and the Pahlavis and the legacy, just 2 steps back. I mean,
sure.
I'm just curious what happens to this fertile movement of the constitutionalists who win by 1909. I mean, I guess by 1914, say, Iran is a fundamentally different place from what it had been a decade earlier. But this movement for liberal reforms, is it just that between the ongoing opposition from the Qajar regime, the clerical conservatives, the external great powers, Russia, etc., it just loses its momentum? Is that what happens?
No, I mean, it loses its momentum, really, because it finds that actually its ambition far exceeds its capabilities. I mean, that's the simple, So, there's enormous enthusiasm. I mean, one of the striking documents I found and is very interesting is that Muhammad Ali Furughi, the great intellectual and I would say godfather of national identity in Iran and nationalism, he writes a handbook for the first deputies of 1906 of what it means to be a deputy. What you're meant to do. This is the form of governments, and he basically takes the British and the French systems, and he says, this is what a right is. This is what your rights are. This is what legislation is. This is how you should vote. I mean, these are very basic handbooks. So what you see is that actually there are people learning on the go. I mean, they're sort of the practicalities is learning. But what they find is they have these marvelous ideas. I mean, a lot of these ideas are then implemented under Reza Shah, of course. I mean, that's what happens. Reza Shah is the implementation period. But it takes them a long time to realize that, they can't do these things. And of course, when the First World War hits, it basically, central government in Iran, collapses in the First World War. I mean, there is no central government. It's basically local.
Before the First World War, though, by 1914, what would you say? I mean, how successful would you, 100 years later, in assessing this, how successful were Iranian constitutionalists of the early 20th century in defining that relationship between the religious and the political spheres in Iran by 1914, say?
Well, this is the interesting thing, and then again, it's a very pertinent question. I mean, basically what I would say is they were extremely successful in defining the new language of politics, but they were woeful at implementing it. I mean, that's basically, the distinction. So even by 1914, I mean, there's not a huge amount that they can. I mean, the situation is very, very tough. But it's certainly true that they redefine the whole language. And one of the reasons they do that, of course, is because these are all intellectuals. And what they all go down doing is they all go writing histories and stories and narratives, and they lay down the template. I mean, that's what's quite interesting about it. It's like, history being written by the losers in this case, because all the losers are intellectuals and write. And they write a lot about it, and they make, they say, why did we get this wrong? Why did we not get? But what they do is they embed the whole movement within the national consciousness, within the literary consciousness, if I can put it that way. And it becomes very prominent. And of course, because the constitutional revolution had huge support among even intellectuals in, prominent intellectuals in Britain and other places. I mean, they supported it. It was magnified. It was amplified, if I can put it that way. The fact that the British government didn't support it is neither here nor there in that sense. But the fact is, it became embedded within this narrative of political awakening, national awakening, if you will. And so, in that sense, I think they were enormously successful.
Some final questions before I let you go on legacy of this pivotal moment. So, if the constitutional revolution remains this turning point in the history of Iran as a step forward on the path to socio-political modernity.
Yeah.
How much of the political achievements of that moment remain intact over the years of the Pahlavi dynasty? Again, there seems to be a paradox when we get to Reza Shah, where he implements and oversees, presides over a lot of the dreams of this constitutional movement. And at the same time, when it comes to reign over rule of the monarch, that's not exactly what pans out, right?
That's right. So, I mean, what Reza Shah does is he's basically, with his supporters, it has to be said, and this is one of the interesting things. I mean, Reza Shah is surrounded by people who are constitutionalists. I mean, they're part of that revolutionary movement. And the main objective there is to build the state. I mean, basically their argument is, we'll build the state, we'll build the bureaucracy, then we can start to do the things we want to do, and then we can start implementing the second stage of the constitution, which is basically to, essentially to democratize, as we would understand it. Of course, what Reza Shah does is he basically, whether by deliberately or otherwise, basically only gets to the position where he builds the state. And one of the striking things, for instance, and I think one of the great failures of the Reza Shah period in that sense, there are many great successes, but those failures, is basically when he develops the independent, when I say when he develops a judiciary, penal codes, law systems, what they develop basically is, ironically, the rights of the state. They talk about the rights of the state, but they don't actually develop the concept of the rights of the citizen. So they don't balance out the development of a mighty state with various limitations or protections for the citizen, and that is really left to his son.
Why don't they?
I think part of it is time. To be honest, part of it is a determined. So I mean, Reza Shah comes in. I mean, really, his active period is from 1924 to 1941. He's very anxious, for his own mind. He sees himself very much as a sort of a ruling monarch, certainly. Interestingly, he identifies himself as a national or a constitutional monarch. He sees himself as constitutional. He's not. I mean, obviously, in many ways. But, because he contrasts himself with the Rajahs before him, he says, basically, I'm much more, modern in my thinking than the Rajahs ever were. But I think, partly it's personal preference. There's no doubt about it. I don't think he fully understood necessarily that sort of, constitutional element, the sort of legal side of it for citizens. Part of it is time. I mean, I think there were limited, it is possible that had he not been deposed in 1941, that the development of the state could have gone further in the particular direction that would be more favourable. I mean, there are a variety of issues around that. I would say it's a combination, really, of his own, I suppose, preferences, certainly by the end of his reign and his rule, a certain paranoia. But also, I think, when you look at it, really, the relative short amount of time that he was there compared to, successive.
What about his son,
rulers.
Mohammad Reza Shah?
Well, his son, I think, so his son has the opportunity, I think. But I think also what his son does is he emphasizes, in my view, mistakenly, still quite dramatic in some ways, but he emphasizes economic over political development. And I think that's a mistake. I think ultimately what Mohammad Reza Shah should have done is basically completed, in a sense, the revolution begun under the constitutionalists, implemented in good measure, but not completed by his father. It was up to Mohammad Reza Shah to complete that. Instead, unfortunately, I think, in the 1970s, really intoxicated with oil wealth and other things, he moved more and more towards a much more autocratic system than was certainly necessary. I think by that stage, given the rapid growth in education, the rapid economic growth, so on and so forth, there was huge scope for much, much more engaged public political participation, which just simply didn't happen.
Let me ask you about post-1979, because you started this most interesting chat today. He's saying that some of the vestiges, the parliamentary standards have remained intact. It would seem like the Islamic Republic of today is a renouncement of everything that the constitutional revolution would have stood for, at least when it comes to the secularizing and parliamentary system parts of it. What do you think we are to make of the legacy of the constitutional revolution in Iran today under the Islamic Republic?
Well, two things to bear in mind. One is that in the original constitution, of course, in 1906, there was also meant to be a council of 5 leading mujtahids who were meant to survey and look at law and make sure it's compatible with Islam. I mean, Islam and Shia Islam was still, if you look at the constitution, absolutely fundamental to the constitution of 1906. But you're quite right to say that obviously what people did is they moved to a much more secular and nationalist angle. Now, with the revolution in 1979, of course, this was an attempt, in a sense, to marry two quite distinct principles. One was a republican system that was based essentially on the French system, married to this concept of Redefining and others. And on that level, yes, you're quite right to say that it proved to be a very, very unhappy marriage. I mean, it wasn't going to work. And what we've seen subsequently really is the sort of collapse of that republican element that was, at the foundation of the constitution in 1979 under the weight of this sort of Islamic autocracy. So in that sense, yes, I mean, it has suppressed those sort of ideals. That said, what's very interesting is that they maintain the Majlis as this sort of house of the people. Yes, they call it Islamic rather than national, but it's still a Majlis and it's still very important. And many of the reformers, many of the intellectuals in Iran today, many of the sort of more progressive, all trace their origins back to 1906. And even, in the centenary of the Constitutional Revolution in 2006, there were huge numbers of discussions about how far have we come, how far do we still need to go, to be honest, which was quite far. And repeatedly, if you look at accounts in Iran, they always talk about, the Constitutional Revolution as the moment which we have to refer back to, and that's quite interesting. Obviously, the authorities in the Islamic Republic and the hardliners and the clerics tend to want to rubbish the Constitutional Revolution. They want to dismiss it. They think people like Fourouri and Tahrizadeh are all stooges of the West and so on and so forth. But it's quite interesting to see when you look a little bit deeper that these people are actually much, much more widely read in Iran today than perhaps the authorities would like.
A final question to you.
Sure.
You said something really interesting. I don't know, halfway through this, you said something like, we look at the British, the French, the Americans, but there's the rest of the world too. And I wonder if we could take a macro look at this constitutional revolution, because yes, it's easy to sort of, in contradistinction to Britain or America, say, well, Iran was 200 years behind, but it wasn't for the Middle East. This is this constitutional revolution was, as I understand it, quite progressive or ahead of its time to a certain extent. Can you speak to that in terms of a final thought on the legacy?
I would. I mean, what I'd say is one has to be careful because the Ottoman constitution, of course, took place in 1876, but the Ottoman constitution didn't get anywhere. It lasted 2 years. And of course that ultimately failed and you get different, but you get a different outcome with the Young Turk Revolution in 1908. But nonetheless, there's a huge amount of overlap, a huge amount of communication between the Iranians and the Ottomans on political reform. But what's also striking is, I mentioned earlier also that, the defeat of the Russians to the Japanese in 1904. What's interesting is these sort of things reverberate around the world, and there are you can see comparative developments taking place in China. You see developments in India. You see, where there is a sort of general movement. And of course, the Iranians were in some ways, I wouldn't say necessarily, at the forefront of this, but they were certainly, in my view, certainly the constitution was amongst the most progressive constitutions of its time for the non-European world, if I can put it, and I include the America in this. So it is certainly interesting that I think they were at the forefront of some of these developments. But in terms of the most prominent in the Middle East, it really depends whether you count the Ottoman Empire as part of the Middle East.
Is Turkey in the Middle East?
Yeah, you see that. So I mean,
let's say no, so that we can claim to be first. Yeah.
So if you exclude the Ottomans, then we're absolutely on very safe ground.
Dr. Ali Ansari, I've very much enjoyed this. Thank you for this. I hope you do come back.
Thank you. Yes, it'd be an absolute pleasure. Maybe we can do Reza Shah next time.
Oh, that would be a pleasure. Thank you. Khudafis.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Dr. Ali Ansari, joining me from Fife, Scotland. That's it for this episode of Rook. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks to the amazing team who put this show together each week. Super Parisa, Smart Pegah, Savvy Roham, Bearded Omid, Talented Anahita, Methodical Kaveh. Thank you to all of you out there supporting us and sharing our content. Please subscribe if you have not done so already. Remember, Rook Live 3 tickets are available now. Go to our Instagram page at Rook Media. And in the bio, you can link to how to get tickets. The good seats are going fast. You can find me on Instagram at Jian Gomeshi. And as ever, Mizun Bashin.